next up is myself.
Hi, everyone. You all know me. I'm Jaap Nienhuis. I'm from Utrecht University. I'm trying to take this to a global perspective and say something not just about sediment transport, but about the resulting morphology of river deltas. And I'm trying to also give you some implications for carbon dynamics toward the end. So I'm going to discuss delta morphology. What do deltas look like now? Morphodynamics, so how do deltas change over time? And then what does that have to do with carbon? First, we've mostly heard about the big deltas that are out there, but T.S. also mentioned that there are many, many smaller deltas, and I really think it's necessary to kind of integrate all of them, particularly when we think about end members and how these different end members affect the total carbon export to the ocean. So just to highlight, this is, of course, Earth. We can zoom into a random selection of coastline. This is the Alaska North Slope. We can see the Mackenzie. We can zoom in even further and find deltas at many, many different scales. This is the Colville here. Zoom in even further, find deltas again, zoom in even further, find deltas again, and zoom in even further. I don't know if you call this a delta. It's a river mouth. There could be some carbon in there. I don't know. Anyway, if we add a lot of these deltas together, we get to about 10,000, but there are many, many more smaller ones. And I say ones because I don't know if they're deltas or not, but there are going to be many, many of these river mouths that are exporting carbon, and many of them will be deltas. One thing that we have been working on in the past is to try to formalize how we look at delta morphology. And this is work that we finally published as a methods paper, myself and my former postdoc, Juan Paniagua Arohave. And the way we do that is by looking at, this is a simple river mouth here that is forced by some sort of river sediment flux, Q river. The second sediment flux we look at is the tidal sediment flux that moves sediment in and out of the river mouth. And then the third one is the wave-driven sediment flux, Q wave, that moves sediment away from the river mouth. Right? And depending on the relative magnitude of these three sediment fluxes, you're either going to be wave-dominated and have a straight coastline like the Eel, you're going to be river-dominated like the Mississippi, or you're going to be tide-dominated like the Elbe, and you really are an alluviated estuary in this case. All right, so we have this simple framework of three key sediment fluxes, and the nice thing about these three sediment fluxes is that we can estimate them a priori, so based on boundary conditions or global models, and we don't need to observe all of these 10,000 deltas one by one. All right, so we have global wave models like NOAA Wave Watch that we use to get this Q wave, this wave-driven sediment flux. We have global tide models like TOPEX to get into angular velocities and tidal amplitudes globally for our wave-driven sediment flux. And we have empirical river sediment models to get us an idea about how much sediment is delivered to all of these 10,000 river mouths. And based on these three data sets and some other data sets as well, we can plot all of these 10,000 deltas into this triangle, and the size of the circle denotes the size of the delta. So you immediately see that on this river to tide axis, that's where all the big deltas are, including the Mississippi, of course. The Ganges, Brahmaputra is more tide dominated. And what you also see is that many of these smaller dots are going to be small wave dominated river deltas. You can plot them again on this global map and see again this overall magnitude of small wave-dominated deltas that you see everywhere along the coastline. But looking at global fluxes, and as we're trying to kind of combine global fluxes for deltas and carbon, I think it's nice to see that when you look at the discharge, we find that about 50% of all global water discharge empties and enters the ocean through tide-dominated deltas. About 31% enters the ocean through river-dominated deltas, and 16% enters through wave-dominated deltas. With sediment supply, it's even more heavily weighted towards the tide and river end members. And then looking, of course, at what Marissa said and also what Mead said before, I think that last part of the delta is going to be really important for carbon cycling and carbon storage. So it matters if you're going to be dominated by tides or dominated by some of these other processes in the last stretch of the river. If you're tired of looking at triangles like me, we also now have a delta square. So you're not just limited to triangles when you look at deltas. So what about morphodynamics? So how do these deltas change over time? We can use this same framework again and say, well, if some of human influence, for example, like the Nile, they build a dam, and so the Q River is changing in the case of the Nile from being wave-dominated to being even more wave-dominated. And we can have a morphologic prediction that we attach to this decrease in fluvial sediment flux, and that's a decrease in the protrusion angle. So you go from kind of a pointy cuspate wave-dominated delta to a flatter wave-dominated delta. And this is then also something that we can observe by looking at time-lapse imagery, for example, in this case of the mouth of the Nile. We can also look at the tide-dominated system. This is the Colorado in the US and Mexico. And of course, that also experienced a great decrease in water discharge and sediment discharge to the ocean. And in that case, it's moving toward the tide-dominated end member, and we predict an infilling of delta channels and a trend towards being more of an alluvial estuary. And we can also see this when we look at time lapses, in this case of the Colorado River Delta. Right, so we can tie changes in sediment fluxes to changes in delta morphology, and we can do this globally for all these 10,000 deltas by looking at global estimates of how humans have modified the fluvial sediment flux to the ocean. So you see a lot of arrows pointing up, and that's deforestation and increase in sediment supply, and you can see arrows moving down, and it's mostly reservoirs and other hydropower dams. We can also look at the effects of sea level rise, in this case, primarily looking at the effects of sea level rise on delta area. So for all of these 10,000 deltas, we have a very simple delta model that we apply, looking a little bit at these polygons that Andre also mentioned yesterday. And what we predict in this case is a balance by river sediment supply on one end and sea level rise on the other, that is either leading to land loss or land gain. And you can see in this picture that we tested against observed delta area change from Landsat. And you can see that of course, the Mississippi in this case stands out as a big land loser. But there is also the Ganges Brahmaputra that is gaining land. So we can test our model based on these observations and then run it forward and see the effects of sea level rise on delta area change. This is high end member relative sea level rise scenarios leading to a lot of land loss. The nice thing, however, of this kind of way of looking into the effects of sea level rise is we can add these effects of sea level rise to the delta ternary diagram, because sea level rise also has an expected effect on delta morphology. So, for example, we can expect the increase in sea level will lead to wave-dominated transgression for a lot of deltas that move towards its wave-dominated corner, or a tide-dominated transgression if deltas move toward this tide-dominated corner. And then we can integrate all of these things to look at a net effect of all these individual factors on delta morphology, right? So you might have deforestation that makes a delta a little bit more river dominated. You might have increased storminess that makes it a little bit more wave dominated, or also the effect of sea level rise that leads to an increasing trend away from river dominance. And then the net effect of all of these factors might be morphologic change into this direction. So lastly, what I want to end with is some implications for carbon. This is recent work by a postdoc who was in our group last year looking into the Yellow River Delta. And the Yellow River is a tremendous delta, and there's a lot of morphodynamics. So this is the past 15 years. You can see the scale bar here. There's some great erosion at the former river mouth, and also a lot of new deposition at the new river mouth of up to 8 meters in this time step in these 15 years. And what we've done is we used bathymetric data. This is differencing multi-beam. We have a lot of multi-beam in this case, and we use that to get a geochronology of our cores. So what we've done in the case of the Yellow River Delta is we looked at the different sediment types and looked at if they were recently deposited or if they've been reworked based on our assessment of the multi-beam data, and looked at how that tied to how much carbon was left after all of these cycles of morphodynamic change. And we see that the age in this case matters a lot for how much carbon is left after this continuous recycling that happened in the delta. And with that, thank you so much. All the data is available on GitHub and other websites. And thank you so much.